My grandfather didn't used to say much about his experience of being in both world wars. I think that's a common experience when people are asked about their loved ones who participated and came back. I often hear they never talked about it. So everything I learned about my grandfather's experience, I learned from my father. He was the oldest son of 4 children. And I'll say a little bit more in a minute about what that experience was like. My grandfather was 16 when World War I broke out. He waited a year. He'd heard about the adventure in Europe. He'd heard about an opportunity to lift himself out of the dust bowl of the prairies where he lived. And so he lied about his age at 17, but they didn't let him in. They knew he lied. He had to wait a year. But by the time he was 18, it was 1916 in the fall. It was a brutal year in the war. That was the year that the British and French and German soldiers or armies were said to have been bled that year. So he didn't get to go. He was trained, they began his training, he did basic training, and then he began his training as a heavy-duty mechanic. But he stayed home. In 1939, my grandfather was 41. He had 4 children. They lived in a 4-room house in the little town of Whitlaw in southern Alberta, east of Bow Island, between Lethbridge and Medicine Hat. He enlisted again, and I told you that he was trained as a mechanic. So his job, he worked at the British Air training camp at Suffield, near Medicine Hat. That's where he was posted. And as a mechanic, his job was to take care of and maintain the Curtiss B-36 Hawk single-engine, single-seater, what do you call this? A stick-shift steering mechanism. His job was to maintain those. Those were the planes that were used as training aircraft. And so it wouldn't be unusual for young recruits to crash those planes. Sometimes they lived, oftentimes they didn't. My grandfather's job was to drive around the southern Alberta prairie looking for the crash sites and cleaning up the mess that he would find. He didn't talk about it. I got this out of my dad. Eventually, he did get to go overseas. Like it's some joyride. He was sent overseas, where he would maintain the fighting jets and the on-the-ground equipment. He was stationed in Gander, Newfoundland. That was overseas then. He was there, and while he didn't see active battle, he wasn't on the battlefield, he continued to clean up its mess. My father used to tell this story about his father's involvement in the war, and he used to tell it through the lens of a 13-year-old boy, because that's how old my dad was when my grandfather went away. He was a 13-year-old gunky little teenager, kind of fresh out of grade school. And by the time that my grandfather got home, 2 years later, my dad had grown up. His dad didn't recognize him. My father, as the oldest son, felt a strong responsibility for his siblings and the protection of his mother. It was not a great reunion for either of them. Even as I tell that story, I look out at you, and I know that each of you will have a story about a father or a mother or a grandfather or a grandmother. Each of you will have a story about a sister or a brother or a son or daughter, or a husband's grandfather. And each of you would be able to recount what you remember. Each of you would be able to tell a story. In fact, there's 1.1 million stories, because that's how many Canadians went to war in the Second World War. 1.1 million, 10% of Canada's population saw active duty. Of course, 106,000 stories were silenced, of course. 60,000 of them because of the First World War, 45,000 in the Second World War, and some 1,600 in South Africa, Spain, Korea, 159 in Afghanistan. Stories silenced as casualties of war. Imagine 106,164 stories silenced as casualties of war. And what we're doing this morning is remembering those stories that don't get told. Because for most of those stories, we don't know what happened. We weren't there. Their story is silenced. But we remember them as fallen heroes. That's the language we use. Fallen heroes. Don't do anything for selfish purposes, writes Paul. But with humility, think of others as better than yourselves. Instead of each person watching out for their own good, watch out for what is better for others. Adopt the attitude that was in Christ Jesus. Though he was in the form of God, he didn't consider himself being equal with God as something to exploit. But he emptied himself by taking the form of a slave and by becoming like human beings. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. When Paul came to the city around 49 in the Common Era, Philippi was an urban center at the eastern end of the plain. It was on a trade route. It was a metropolitan center. The people there were both Romans and Greeks, and they spoke predominantly Greek, even though Latin was the official language. The church in Philippi was founded by Paul on his second missionary journey. Paul originally went to that area because of a night vision that he saw, that's recorded in the scriptures. Paul saw a man from the area standing and asking that he come over to help them. So Paul responded, and the gospel went triumphantly westward, beginning in Philippi as the first city to be evangelized in Rome. In this text, Paul is calling Christ's followers to a curious combination of unity and humility as we are called into the practice of mending the world. Unity and humility. Be united with each other as you watch out for what is better for others. Adopt the attitude that was in Christ. Another version says, let the same mind that was in Christ be also in yours. Be in you. I'm thinking of these silent stories of wartime this morning, even as I hold up the death of Christ on a cross. In one hand, my grandfather enlisted because of adventure. because the military would train him to be a mechanic, because it fed his family. The downside of joining the military is that sometimes you have to go to war. My grandfather didn't die doing it. About 106,000 people did. That's just a little smaller than the whole of North Vancouver. Are they heroes? Was it sacrificial? That's in one hand. In the other hand, I hold up the mind and the humility of Christ, who humbled himself, taking the form of a slave. Was he a hero? Was that sacrificial? I don't have clear answers for those questions. I know two things this morning. If our caring for the world, if our mending of the world does not come from a place of understanding the unity of all of humankind, no one is better than the other. No one. If it doesn't come from that place, and the place of humility, being all of who you are, if it doesn't come from that place, then our mending of the world is patriarchal and it's patronizing. Stop doing it. The other thing I know is that death is not God's final answer. Death is not God's final intention. Life is. The soldiers who never returned, regardless of their motivation, made it possible for others to live. That's especially true when those people who were waiting their turn in Auschwitz saw them coming. They made it possible for them to live. What is absolutely true is that in Christ, we are all made alive. That is God's intention. I came that they might have life and have it abundantly. May the words of my mouth, the meditations of our hearts, speak the truth this day, on the day we remember. Please pray with me. Sometimes there's just not enough silence, oh God. I just want to hold the space. We're approaching this story from our own unique and terrifying places. Each of us held in a common experience of remembering. Each held in the common experience of your promise that this is not the end. May that truth be written on our hearts for the healing of the world.